Imagine a world where it is literally illegal for an employer to ask if you have a high school diploma.
Right. Like it's actually a crime.
Exactly. Imagine you're going into a job interview for this highly technical position like engineering or accounting or, maybe even something in the medical field. And the hiring manager is legally forbidden from asking where you went to college.
Or if you even graduated at all.
Yeah, exactly. Or how many years you spent in a classroom. Like, it would be treated with the exact same legal taboo as asking who you voted for or what church you attend.
Which, I mean, that just sounds like absolute chaos to our modern ears, right?
Well, complete chaos.
Yeah.
But what if that level of radical dismantling is exactly what society needs to, well, actually become educated?
Yeah.
You're tuning into this deep dive today because you're the kind of person who doesn't just accept the world as it's handed to you. You want to look under the hood.
You really want those ideas that challenge the absolute bedrock of how we live.
Right. And today we are unpacking a text that takes a literal sledgehammer to the most universally accepted institution on the planet. I mean, the school system. We're looking at the provocative, totally paradigm-shifting essays of Ivan Illich. Specifically, we're diving into his seminal work, Why We Must Disestablish School.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is the sheer scale of his critique.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Illich isn't here to just complain about underfunded classrooms or, suggest we need better standardized testing. His foundational argument is that the very concept of mandatory institutionalized schooling is actively destructive to human beings.
Right, because Illich uses the school as a blueprint. Like, it's the ultimate paradigm to explain the dysfunction of all modern bureaucratic institutions. By tearing down the illusion of what schooling actually accomplishes, he's trying to show us how modern society subtly strips away our independence.
It turns us into these passive consumers of institutional services.
Exactly. So the mission of our deep dive today is to really explore Illich's vision of a completely deschooled society. We need to examine how his critique fundamentally alters how we view our own competence, and why his, frankly, radical solutions might actually be the key to genuine, lifelong learning.
Yeah, and just a quick note for you as we get rolling here. Because we are looking at deeply historical and analytical source material, the text naturally touches on some pretty heavily charged political figures and movements.
Oh, definitely. Everyone from Richard Nixon to Karl Marx.
Right, exactly. So we are exploring Illich's philosophical framework strictly as it is presented in his essays. We aren't taking any political sides here, and we aren't endorsing the ideologies or historical figures mentioned.
Yeah, our goal is just to impartially and thoroughly break down the original source material so you can weigh these massive structural ideas for yourself.
Totally. So to understand why someone would want to completely dismantle the concept of a school, we have to start with the psychological trick that Illich claims the institution plays on every single one of us.
Right. The foundation of Illich's entire worldview rests on this concept of the grand illusion.
The grand illusion.
Yeah. He argues that from the very moment a child enters a mandatory classroom, they're subjected to this profound blurring of reality. The institution systematically trains students, and particularly those from poorer backgrounds who, intuitively feel the friction of the system, to confuse process with substance.
Okay, process with substance. So this is the great psychological shift he talks about.
Exactly. To be schooled, in Illich's vocabulary, is essentially to be conditioned. Students are conditioned to confuse the physical, bureaucratic act of teaching with the internal, transformative event of actually learning.
So they mistake the bureaucracy for the benefit. I mean, it's like confusing the receipt for a gym membership with actually being physically fit.
Oh, that's a perfect way to put it.
Right, like you have the piece of paper that proves you paid for the process. You swiped your card, you walked through the turnstiles, you stood in the building. And because you did all that, you trick yourself into thinking you have the muscle.
Yeah, or it's like confusing a menu with a meal.
Yes. You sit at the table, you read these beautiful descriptions of the food, you participate in the entire ritual of the restaurant, but you aren't actually metabolizing any nutritional substance.
You're just staring at the curriculum, mistaking the syllabus for knowledge.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredibly bleak when you frame it like that.
Well, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, this institutionalization of values operates almost like a virus. It escapes the school and infects every single aspect of our lives.
Oh, so?
Because once our imaginations are schooled to accept a highly structured service in place of a tangible value, we apply that flawed logic everywhere. We begin to mistake medical treatment for actual health.
Wow.
We mistake police protection for actual safety. We mistake social work for the genuine, organic improvement of community life. We even look at the exhausting daily rat race and we mistake it for productive, meaningful work.
Because we've been trained that if there's no official institution managing it, it isn't real.
Exactly. And that leads to what Illich calls psychological impotence. When you surrender your agency to the hospital for your health, and to the police for your safety, and to the school for your intellect, you lose the fundamental belief that you can solve your own problems.
You become entirely dependent on the system.
Entirely. But the most dangerous part of this cycle is what happens when these institutions inevitably fail to deliver the substance they promised. Society has been so thoroughly conditioned that we've adopted this bizarre, unbreakable assumption, which is escalation leads to success.
Escalation leads to success, which means if the treatment isn't working, we never question the treatment itself.
Never. We just assume we didn't get enough of it.
Right, like if schools are churning out kids who can't read or think critically, the public discourse never suggests that, hey, maybe forcing kids to sit in rows in a cinder block room for 12 years is just a bad mechanism for learning.
Yeah, that thought is practically heresy.
Totally. The only solution we can even conceptualize is throwing more money, more administrative bloat, and more standardized testing at the exact same failing structure. We view the failure of the institution as proof that we need more of the institution.
The circular logic is just ironclad. The institution creates the demand for its own expansion, and it simultaneously delegitimizes anything that happens outside of its walls. Both the wealthy and the poor begin to view self-directed, independent learning with deep, deep suspicion.
Yeah, if you try to organize your own community to solve a local problem without official city funding or oversight, it's viewed as subversive.
We literally lose the capacity to imagine a world where humans just learn from each other.
Think about your own life for a second. Like, how many times have you genuinely wanted to learn a new skill? Maybe you wanted to learn Python or conversational French or, I don't know, how to rebuild a motorcycle engine.
Right, something practical or just interesting.
And how quickly did you abandon that desire because you didn't have the time or the money to enroll in an official accredited course?
We completely outsource our own potential because we've been schooled to believe that if a certified expert isn't handing us a syllabus, any learning we do on our own is somehow illegitimate or unreliable.
And this brings us to a really critical transition in Illich philosophy. Because if institutions successfully convince the public that official processes are the only valid way to exist in society, we have to look at what happens to the people who are systematically locked out of those processes.
Right, the people who can't afford the receipt.
Exactly. Illich calls this phenomenon the modernization of poverty.
The modernization of poverty. That implies that poverty isn't a static concept, right? Like it's something that evolves alongside technology and bureaucracy.
It changes completely. Historically, poverty was a lack of basic human sustenance, food, shelter, warmth. But once a society translates basic human needs into demands for scientifically produced commodities and institutional treatments, the technocrats get to define what poverty is. Okay, so the definition shifts.
Yeah, poverty is no longer just starvation. It becomes the state of having fallen behind an advertised ideal of consumption. The goalposts are constantly moved by the very institutions that claim to be helping.
The text has this incredibly striking comparison to illustrate this. Illich was writing this after spending significant time in Latin America, and he brings up Mexico.
Right, the contrast between traditional and modern.
Yeah. He says that just 10 years prior, it was completely normal for a person to be born in their own home, to die in their own home, and to be buried by their friends and family. It was a communal, organic part of life. The only thing the institutional church handled was the needs of the soul.
But then poverty was modernized.
Exactly. Suddenly, beginning and ending your life at home became a marker of extreme, tragic destitution.
Or, ironically, a sign of extreme, untouchable privilege. The vast middle ground of normal human experience was just erased. Dying was brought under the strict institutional management of hospitals, doctors, and undertakers.
To die without an IV in your arm became a failure of the state.
Exactly. And he applies this directly to the schooling metric. In Mexico at the time, the poor were officially defined as those who lacked 3 years of schooling. But in New York, the poor were defined as those who lacked 12 years.
Wow.
Yeah, the institution simply recalibrates the definition of inadequacy to justify its own continued expansion.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here because this is where the text gets incredibly controversial. Illich points out that the poor in the United States, compared to the global South, receive a massive amount of this institutional treatment.
He does, yeah.
He explicitly notes that the U.S. poor can count on truant officers to literally force their kids into a classroom until they are 17 years old. He noted they can get a doctor to assign them a hospital bed that costs $60 a day.
And we have to remember the context of that dollar amount.
Right? He adds the context that at the time, $60 was the equivalent of 3 months' income for a majority of the global population. So to almost anyone looking at that objectively, guaranteed schooling until 17 and access to a wildly expensive hospital bed sounds like a triumph of modern civilization. Why is Illich positioning this as a tragedy?
It sounds counterintuitive, I know, until we look at the psychological toll of that specific type of care. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Illich argues that this highly expensive, modernized treatment actually strips people of their power and dignity.
Because they have no say in it.
Exactly. When you are assigned a $60 a day hospital bed that you have absolutely no control over, or when a truant officer forces you into a classroom for 12 years where you are systematically alienated from your own culture and community, you are being made increasingly dependent.
You're just a cog in their treatment plan.
Right, and it produces immense anger and frustration because the institution dictates the terms of your survival. You are taught that you are helpless without the bureaucracy, yet the bureaucracy does not actually solve your underlying problems, it just manages your symptoms.
And he brings receipts to back this up. He points to a massive federal aid program from the 1960s known as Title I.
Yes, Title I, a perfect example.
Between 1965 and 1968, the United States poured over $3 billion into schools specifically targeted to offset the disadvantages of about 6 million low-income children. $3 billion. He calls it the most expensive compensatory education program ever attempted in human history.
And the results were just a profound validation of Illich's theory.
They were dismal, right?
Completely. Despite that unprecedented flood of funding, researchers could detect no significant improvement in the learning of those disadvantaged children. In fact, compared to their classmates from middle-income homes, the disadvantaged kids actually fell further behind during those years. The modernized treatment failed completely.
And society's reaction to that failure was incredibly predictable, right? Illich says people offered 3 excuses. First, $3 billion just wasn't enough money. We need to escalate. Second, the administrators were incompetent, so we just need better bureaucratic management.
And third, the really uncomfortable one.
The third explanation is Illich's core thesis. Educational disadvantage simply cannot be cured by relying on education within the school system.
Right, because while people might argue over budgets and management, the deeper structural reality is that the money spent through a school budget rarely actually reaches the child.
Where does it go?
That $3 billion went to building physical plants, paying administrative salaries, funding custodial care, and expanding the indoctrination process. It padded the budgets of the schools, which ironically enabled those schools to cater even more effectively to the richer children who already knew how to navigate the system.
Right, because the wealthy kid doesn't rely solely on the school for their education anyway. The middle class or wealthy child goes home to casually available advantages. A house full of books, parents with the leisure time for deep conversation, vacation travel, and cultural immersion.
Exactly. If you throw $1 billion at a school building, you do absolutely nothing to equalize the social reality outside of that building.
This forces us to confront a mathematical impossibility. If throwing unprecedented billions of dollars at the system doesn't cure educational disadvantage and actually just further entrenches the power of the institution, can we ever realistically afford to provide truly equal schooling to everyone?
Illich looks at the math and concludes that it is structurally and economically impossible. Obligatory schooling is an economic absurdity.
The numbers he pulls from the text are staggering. At the time of his writing, the U.S. was spending $36 billion on schooling. But to provide what educators considered true equal treatment for everyone in grammar and high school, the math showed it would require $80 billion a year.
And it was only going up.
Yeah, the projections for 1974 indicated the cost would balloon to $107 billion. He points out the dark irony that the U.S., which was spending nearly $80 billion on defense, including the Vietnam War, was mathematically too poor to actually provide equal schooling to its own citizens.
And the inequality isn't a glitch, right? It is baked into the very design of how schools are funded. He highlights a sharp, systemic discrimination in the allocation of public funds. The richest 10% of parents end up obtaining 10 times the per capita amount of public funds compared to the poorest 10%.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting because I had to stop and reread that part of the text.
Yeah.
If it's public tax money, shouldn't be distributed equally per student. How do the rich siphon off 10 times the amount?
They do it through attrition. The system is designed so that the longer you stay in school, the exponentially more expensive your education becomes to the taxpayer. A year in a university requires vastly more infrastructure, highly paid professors, and resources than a year in elementary school.
Okay, that makes sense.
And who are the students that survive the grueling 12-year gauntlet of primary and secondary school to reach the university? It is overwhelmingly the children of the wealthy who have the outside support systems to succeed. Because the wealthy advance to university, which relies heavily on tax-derived finances, they are pulling massive amounts of public money toward their own advanced degrees.
Wow. Meanwhile, the poor student who drops out in ninth or 10th grade receives a tiny fraction of that public investment, and then they're locked out of the economy for not having a degree.
It's a highly regressive tax masquerading as a progressive social good. And he shows how this isn't just a domestic issue. It creates what he calls an international caste system.
An international caste system.
Yeah. Entire nations are graded, rated, and treated like castes based on the average years of schooling of their citizens. He uses Latin America as a prime example, noting that the amount of public money spent on a single graduate student is between 350 to 1,500 times the amount spent on the median citizen.
The psychological damage of this on a global scale has to be devastating.
It is. The majority of the global population becomes hooked on school. They're indoctrinated to judge their own self-worth by North American middle-class standards of prolonged multi-decade schooling, but they are mathematically and economically locked out of ever achieving it.
It breeds a profound society-wide sense of inferiority. They believe they're inherently lesser because they couldn't consume enough of the institutional process.
Precisely.
To really drive home how dangerous this ideology is, Illich makes a chilling comparison. He says the escalation of the school system is identical to the escalation of the military-industrial complex and the arms race. Both are highly destructive. Those schools hide their destruction behind the guise of care. A successful school system simply schools parents and pupils to demand a larger, more invasive school system. There are no logical limits to how much of a child's life the school can claim to need.
And the text provides a terrifying historical footnote to illustrate this concept of no logical limits. Illich references a memorandum written by Dr. Arnold Hutschnecker.
Oh man, this guy.
Yeah, a psychiatrist who had treated President Richard Nixon.
This part of the deep dive is wild. Walk us through exactly what this doctor proposed to the leader of the free world.
Well, Dr. Hutschnecker submitted a formal recommendation to the president suggesting that every single child in the United States between the ages of 6 and 8 be subjected to a mandatory professional psychological examination.
Every single 6 to 8-year-old.
Yes, and the stated goal was to ferret out children who possessed destructive tendencies. For those identified by the state as potentially problematic, obligatory treatment would be mandated. And if that treatment failed, these children would be removed from society and placed in special institutional camps for re-education.
Preventive concentration camps for 6-year-olds who might become delinquents later in life. I mean, that is dystopian.
It is. And Illich's point isn't just that this doctor was an extremist. Illich's point is that under the accepted logic of obligatory schooling, where the state already claims the right to diagnose your deficiencies and force you into a building for 12 years to treat them, these camps are just a logical improvement on the existing system.
Right. If the school is already allowed to claim total ownership over a child's cognitive development, why wouldn't they also claim ownership over their psychological development?
Exactly. This is why Illich argues that equating equal educational opportunity with obligatory schooling is like confusing salvation with the church.
Oh, that's a heavy comparison.
School has ceased to be an educational tool and has become the world religion of a modernized proletariat. The state drafts all citizens into a highly rigid, graded curriculum. It forces them to participate in sequential initiation rituals, which we call diplomas.
Initiation rituals. Wow.
And the modern state enforces the dogmatic judgments of its educators through truant officers and employment requirements in the exact same way that kings used to enforce the judgments of theologians through the Inquisition.
Okay, so we are staring down the barrel of a system that is economically doomed, mathematically rigged against the poor, psychologically damaging, and operating with the unchecked, zealous overreach of a state religion. If throwing money at it makes it worse, and reforming the curriculum doesn't address the structural rot, What is the alternative? Does Illich just expect us to burn the buildings down and wander the woods?
Not at all. This brings us to his ultimate structural solution, the constitutional disestablishment of school.
Right. So Illich doesn't advocate for chaotic destruction. He advocates for legal and structural separation, and he looks directly to history for the blueprint. 2 centuries ago, the framers of the United States Constitution recognized the immense danger of a state-sponsored monopoly on truth, so they led a movement to disestablish the church.
They legally separated church and state.
Exactly. And Illich argues that today, the school has assumed the exact same monopolistic religious power, and we desperately need the constitutional disestablishment of the school. He actually drafts a proposed new First Amendment in the text. He writes, "The state shall make no law with respect to the establishment of education. There shall be no ritual obligatory for all."
Disestablishing the school means breaking its legal monopolistic hold on society's reward system. Because school functions like a religion, complete with its infallible theologians, the educators, and its sacred initiation rituals, the diplomas, we have to make it illegal for society to mandate participation in those rituals.
Practically speaking, what does that look like?
Specifically, Illich says we need a law absolutely forbidding discrimination in hiring, in voting, or in admission to any center of learning based on a person's previous attendance at some curriculum.
Okay, I have to stop and push back on this because when I was reading the source material, this is the exact moment my brain started throwing up red flags.
It's a huge mental leap, for sure.
Right, let's look at the real world. If society passed a law tomorrow that made it illegal for employers to discriminate based on degrees, how does anything function?
Right.
If I'm hiring a structural engineer to build a bridge or a surgeon to operate on my heart, I need to know they went to medical school or engineering school. If employers can't look at a bachelor's degree or a high school diploma, how on earth do they assess competence? Does Illich just want chaos?
It is the most natural objection to his theory because our imaginations are so thoroughly schooled.
Yeah.
But Illich anticipates this, and he makes a razor-sharp distinction. He clarifies that he is not at all against rigorous, practical performance tests of competence.
Okay.
If you want to hire a typist, you don't need to know if they passed a high school history class. You give them a typing test. If you want to hire a surgeon, you test their anatomical knowledge and surgical skill. What Illich is fundamentally against is judging people based on their learning pedigree.
The learning pedigree. So it's the difference between testing the actual output versus judging the historical process of how they got there.
Yes. He argues that the process by which someone acquired a skill, or how many years of public money were spent keeping them in a classroom, is entirely irrelevant to their ability to perform a function. Inquiries into a person's learning history should become socially and legally taboo.
Like asking about religion or politics.
Exactly. We already accept this in other areas of life. We have laws making it illegal to ask about a candidate's political affiliation, their church attendance, or their racial background during a job interview. Illich argues it should be equally illegal to ask about their prior schooling. The focus must remain entirely 100% on demonstrated, testable competence.
Okay, conceptually that's brilliant. It strips away the elitism of the Ivy League versus the community college or the dropout versus the graduate, but it leads to a massive practical hurdle.
How do they get the skills?
Yes. If we decouple a person's worth from their diplomas, we still need a society filled with typists and plumbers and coders and engineers. If we aren't forcing kids into a 12-year curriculum, how do people actually acquire these skills?
To solve the practical mechanics of a deschooled society, Illich splits learning into two entirely distinct, separate categories: skill acquisition and liberal education. These require completely different approaches.
Let's tackle hard skills first.
Good. Illich points out a reality we often ignore. Most learning actually happens casually, entirely outside of school walls. Normal children learn the incredibly complex syntax of their first language casually. Most people who read widely and with genuine pleasure learn to do so outside of formal, graded instruction.
But casual learning won't teach you how to fix a transmission or write software.
No, it won't. For hard skills, what he calls definable and predictable behaviors like typing, plumbing, coding, or speaking a second language, Illich says that old-fashioned, highly focused drill instruction is incredibly effective.
Okay, drill instruction.
And here's the kicker. He argues that a motivated student can master a complex hard skill in a matter of months, not years, if they are taught through intense drill methods that are entirely decoupled from a broader, irrelevant curriculum.
That decoupling is vital. Because in the current system, if you want to learn how to repair a television, The school forces you to also take physical education, civics, and literature. The school makes skill learning agonizingly inefficient because it chains the skill to irrelevant academic tasks.
Exactly. By isolating the skill, the time required to master it plummets.
The text shares this incredible historical anecdote from 1956 to prove exactly how fast and effective skill acquisition can be when you completely bypass the school system. It's the story of Jerry Morris.
This is such a great example.
In the mid-50s, there was a massive migration of Puerto Ricans to New York. The New York Archdiocese suddenly realized they had hundreds of teachers, social workers, and ministers who desperately needed to learn Spanish to communicate with their communities.
A huge undertaking.
Right. The traditional schooling answer would be to send these adults to a university language program for 4 years. But Jerry Morris didn't have 4 years, so what did he do?
He orchestrated a brilliant anti-institutional experiment. He went on a local Spanish-language radio station and simply announced that he needed native Spanish speakers from Harlem to help teach. He didn't ask for teaching degrees. He didn't ask for high school diplomas.
200 teenagers lined up. Morris selected 4 dozen of them, and it is crucial to note that many of these kids were actual high school dropouts. Society had labeled them as failures.
Completely written them off.
Yeah. Morris took these high school dropouts, trained them for just 1 single week using a highly structured drill manual designed by the U.S. Foreign Service Institute, and then put them immediately to work. Each teenager was put in charge of 4 New York professionals who wanted to learn the language.
And the results were a total humiliation of the formal education system. Within 6 months, the mission was accomplished. Cardinal Spellman had 127 parishes where at least 3 staff members could communicate fluently in Spanish. 6 months.
That's unbelievable.
Using high school dropouts as the primary drill instructors, Illich states flatly that no formal school program on Earth could have matched these results in that time frame. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the certification and licensing of teachers is often just a form of market manipulation, protecting the jobs of the educators rather than serving the learners.
So if drills work this well, how do we fund them in a world without schools? This leads to Illich's proposed solution, the Edu credit card.
The Edu credit card.
Yeah, he envisions an educational passport provided to every single citizen at birth. This guarantees equal access to tax-derived educational funds. But instead of forcing you to surrender those funds to a monolithic school system, you keep them. You can spend these credits at independent, highly specialized skill centers whenever you want at any point in your life.
Think about the freedom in that. If you are 35 years old, working a dead-end job, and you decide you want to learn computer programming, you simply take your edu credits to a specialized programming skills center. And Illich notes these centers wouldn't even need to be separate buildings. They could be located at the workplace itself.
Like on-the-job training.
Right. Employers could supply the intense drill instruction, paid for by the edu credits, and immediately provide the job upon completion of the test.
Now, at the time Illich was writing this, there was another popular alternative being floated by a sociologist named Christopher Jenks. Jenks proposed giving parents tuition grants, or what we would call today the voucher system.
Yeah, vouchers are still a huge talking point today.
On the surface, it sounds somewhat similar to edu credits, give the money directly to the people. But Illich absolutely tears the voucher system apart. Why?
Because the critical flaw in Jenks's voucher proposal was the stipulation that these vouchers had to be spent in schools. They could only be redeemed at certified, institutionalized curriculums.
I love the analogy Illich uses to destroy this idea. He says that giving people educational entitlements that are legally restricted to use within schools is like giving a lame man a pair of crutches and stipulating that he use them only if the ends are tied together.
It is entirely self-defeating.
You aren't liberating the learner, you are just forcing them right back into the monopoly of the curriculum. It plays directly into the hands of those who want social advancement tied to a lengthy learning pedigree rather than proven practical knowledge.
But as you mentioned earlier, drills and hard skills are only half of the human equation. Drills are perfect for learning how to fix a transmission or speak Spanish. But what about deep, creative, critical thinking? What about philosophy, literature, and art? You cannot drill someone into having a liberal education.
Exactly. Which brings us to the second half of his solution, what we can call the coffee shop university. Illich is adamant that if schools are inefficient places to learn a hard skill, they are absolutely the worst places on earth for getting an education in the exploratory, creative, liberal sense.
And why is that?
Because schools rely on obligatory attendance and predetermined, rigid curricula. But genuine liberal education requires the surprise of the unexpected question. It requires peers who are voluntarily gathering because they are currently puzzled about the exact same terms or problems.
To facilitate this, Illich outlines a proposal that, frankly, reads like visionary science fiction for the year 1970. He proposed the creation of a massive public computer network.
A computer network in 1970.
Yeah. The mechanics were simple. Anyone in the city could identify themselves to this computer network by inputting their address, their phone number, and the title of a specific book, article, film, or recording they desperately wanted to discuss. The computer would then match them, mailing them a list of other local people who had recently requested a dialogue about that exact same subject.
Think about the mechanics of this. The initiative is left entirely up to the individual. You get your list in the mail. You pick up the phone, you call a stranger from the list, and you agree to meet at a local coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon to discuss a specific essay by George Orwell. You place the book on the table next to your coffee cup so you can recognize each other.
It is a radically simple, decentralized mechanism for matching peers based purely on shared intellectual interest at a specific moment in time.
It is brilliant in its simplicity, but Illich fully anticipated massive resistance from the educational establishment. People's imaginations are so conditioned by the school system that they immediately throw up objections to the idea of free, unlicensed, unchaperoned intellectual exchange. He breaks down the three major objections educators raise and dismantles them.
Let's walk through those because they are so revealing about how we view authority. Objection number 1. Why match people by a specific, narrow book title? Why not match people by a broad theme instead? Like, why not just have a general group for political science instead of a group specifically reading one essay by John Locke?
This raises a vital question about the nature of authority in learning. Illich argues that matching people to explore broad, nebulous themes almost inevitably requires an authoritarian presence, a teacher or a moderator, to define the starting point, set the boundaries, and police the framework of the discussion.
Prepackaged themes rapidly devolve into traditional courses and seminars where one person dictates the reality.
Exactly. But matching by the title of a specific book leaves it entirely to the author of the book to define the terms. The meeting partners accept the author's text as their mutual starting point, and from there they interact as absolute equals. There's no need for a teacher to dictate the boundaries because the text itself provides the anchor.
Objection number 2. Why not filter these match seekers by age or educational background or tested competence? Why on earth would you let an 18-year-old high school dropout meet with a 50-year-old tenured professor to discuss a book?
Illich calls out the blatant elitist snobbery behind this objection. He points out that the real reason professional educators want these demographic restrictions is rooted in contempt for the public.
Contempt for the public. That's strong.
It arises from the paternalistic presumption that everyday people are fundamentally ignorant, and educators harbor a deep-seated fear of the ignorant meeting the ignorant around a complex text they might not perfectly understand. Illich fundamentally trusts the individual. He believes that if two human beings are genuinely, passionately interested in the same text at the same time, their meeting possesses inherent value, regardless of their age, their backgrounds, or their formal pedigree.
And the third objection is the most bureaucratic of all. The critics ask, if we're going to do this, why not have the schools or universities facilitate the space? Let the institutions provide the schedules, the screening, and the safe rooms for these meetings.
His answer is that large bureaucracies are terribly, hopelessly inefficient at facilitating organic human collection. If you leave the initiative entirely to the people, organizations that no one currently considers educational would step up and do it infinitely better. Local restaurant owners, independent publishers, even commuter train executives could promote their spaces as attractive, quiet venues for these intellectual meetings.
A booth in a coffee shop off 4th Avenue is a perfectly fine place to deeply discuss a magazine article for 30 minutes. You aren't obligated to stay for a whole semester, and you don't have to navigate a labyrinthine university admissions process just to earn the right to have a conversation.
Think about the timeline here. Illich is describing this in 1970. A decentralized computer network where you input our hyper-specific interests. The system matches you with peers globally or locally who share that exact niche interest, and you're arranged to dissect and debate it entirely outside of any formal institution.
He basically predicted the architecture of the modern internet. He predicted Reddit threads, he predicted Meetup.com, he predicted Discord servers, and highly specialized web forums.
He recognized that the technological capacity was emerging to completely bypass the school's ancient monopoly on gathering minds together. And today, you, listening right now, have unprecedented, instantaneous access to exactly this kind of title matching.
But the haunting question Illich leaves us with is, are we actually using this technology to truly educate ourselves, or are our imaginations still too schooled up to realize we don't need a professor's permission to learn?
That is the pivotal challenge. Because the ultimate grand vision of all of this, the computer networks, the edgy credit cards, the skill centers, the disestablishment of degrees, is not just to replace the physical building of the classroom. The goal is profound, society-wide transformation. It is about healing a fracture in the human experience. It is about reintegrating the act of learning into the very fabric of daily life.
He paints a beautiful, grounded picture of traditional society to explain what we've lost. Think of a medieval town or an ancient village. In those settings, education wasn't a separate, isolated activity that you commuted to. It was a lifelong, unplanned byproduct of simply living.
Language, architecture, agriculture, religion, daily work, they were all deeply intertwined. If you were an apprentice shoemaker, yes, you were learning a specialized skill, but you were also just immersed in the daily rhythm and politics of the town square. Education didn't compete for time with work or leisure. It was the atmosphere of both.
But modern, industrialized society consciously designed a fracture. We forcefully alienated work from leisure, and we alienated both of them from the concept of learning. We created a highly specialized, full-time, walled-off institution called the school, and we shoved all learning inside it.
But in doing so, we accidentally stripped the rest of the entire world of its educational value. Illich uses a brilliant reference to the pioneering sociologist Emil Durkheim to explain the gravity of this mistake.
Yes, the concept of the sacred and the profane. How does the sociological theory of religion explain the failure of modern schools?
Durkheim noted that the defining essence of formal religion isn't necessarily a belief in gods or the supernatural. The essence of religion is its ability to arbitrarily divide reality into two distinct realms, the sacred and the profane. Illich argues that the obligatory school system does the exact same psychological violence to modern society.
It divides our reality into the academic or pedagogic realm and the non-educational realm.
By legally decreeing that education only happens inside certified school buildings between the hours of 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. under the strict guidance of certified professionals, we have inadvertently declared that the real world, the streets, the factories, the offices, the media, is inherently non-educational and mundane. We have made education unworldly, and we have made the world uneducational.
To prove that we can reverse this, Illich highlights the groundbreaking work of his contemporary, the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. Freire proved exactly how explosive human potential is when you shatter that divide and reconnect learning with the gritty reality of daily life.
Freire went into impoverished rural communities in Brazil and discovered he could teach completely illiterate adults to read and write in just 40 hours. 40 hours, not years grinding away in a cinder block classroom.
And how did he achieve this miracle?
He absolutely refused to use pre-approved, sterile, government-issued textbooks about see-spot run. Instead, he used words deeply charged with political and emotional meaning, pulled directly from the villagers' actual daily struggles.
Freire's method was revolutionary because it was intensely relevant. He would spend time in the community finding out what issues actually mattered to their survival, whether it was the lack of access to a clean well or the crushing compound interest owed to a corrupt landlord. And those vital life-or-death concepts became the first words they learned to spell.
There is a deeply moving image referenced from this work. A laborer who learned to write the word agua water by etching it with his farming hoe into the dirt on his way to the fields. These adults were literally taking the reality of their oppression into their own hands as they learned to write it.
Because the learning was instantly, powerfully applicable to their daily struggle, their motivation to master the skill was immense and unstoppable.
Illich also drops a fascinating historical footnote about Karl Marx to further illustrate this point about integrating learning with life. Now, to be clear, we are looking at the historical philosophy here.
Right.
100 years prior to Illich's writing, Marx famously opposed a proposal in the Gotha program that would have entirely outlawed child labor. Now, obviously, Marx wasn't a fan of exploiting children in dangerous Dickensian factories, but in a broad utopian sense, Marx opposed the total ban because he believed deeply that the greatest fruit of human labor should be the education a person receives from performing it.
He believed that meaningful work itself should be the primary place of education for the young, rather than separating children from the world to sit in sterile isolation.
It is a striking concept, And the point Illich is making by referencing both Marx and Freire isn't to advocate for returning to exploitative child labor or anything simplistic. His goal is to advocate for a society where the ultimate measure of the worth of any institution, whether it is a hospital, a local news program, a city street, or a corporate workplace, is its educational value to the public.
As a group of junior high students in Chicago protested to Illich during his research, participation, not simulation. They didn't want to sit in a desk and simulate life in a classroom. They wanted to participate in the actual world and learn through that vital participation.
So what does this all mean for us today? As we pull all these massive threads together, the illusion of process, the modernization of poverty, the economic impossibility of equality through schooling, and the radical solutions of disestablishment and title matching, it becomes clear that Illich is asking us to do something incredibly difficult.
He isn't just asking us to vote for a different school board. He is asking us to completely free our imaginations. Our imaginations are, as his friend in Chicago noted, all schooled up.
We have permitted the bureaucratic state to define our personal deficiencies, and we have allowed it to force us into a single, specialized, lifelong agency for treatment. We have to break that mental monopoly before we can build anything truly new.
It requires a fundamental, terrifying shift in how we view ourselves and how we view our peers. We must stop shielding our own insecurities behind the armor of certificates and diplomas.
We must gain the courage to talk back, to participate actively in the institutions around us rather than passively consuming their services. We have to reclaim our inherent human right to learn what we want and to instruct others in what we know, completely outside the suffocating confines of an official curriculum.
We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today, unpacking one of the most challenging critiques of modern society ever written. It is a lot to digest, and it challenges almost everything we are taught about success and intelligence.
But before we sign off, we want to leave you with a lingering thought, a question to mull over as you go about your day, building on Illich's vision of a completely deschooled world.
Imagine for a moment that society suddenly woke up and passed Illich's constitutional amendment tomorrow. Imagine that it became entirely illegal for any employer, any client, or any institution to ever ask where you went to school or for how long you attended.
In a world where your official learning pedigree is instantly erased, how would you define your own value?
What hidden skills, what deep, passionate knowledge would you suddenly have the courage to share with the world if you no longer believed you needed an official stamped license to prove you were an expert?
It is a profound, paradigm-shifting question. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible structures around you, keep pushing back against the illusions of the institutions, and above all, keep exploring the world entirely on your own terms. We will catch you next time.